You're listening to an IOE podcast.
Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to shape our everyday lives.
This is Research for the Real World, conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to help shape everyday lives. Hello, I'm Dr Laura Outhwaite and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the UCL Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities, also known as CPO, at IOE, UCL's Faculty of Education and Society. In this season of Research for the Real World, we want to focus on climate justice and development education and how education systems can be reimagined to embed sustainable development principles and practices to bring about positive change and climate justice. So on this episode, I'm absolutely delighted to be talking to Dr. Stuart Tannock. Stuart is an Associate Professor in Sociology of Education based at IOE's Department of Education, Practice and Society. His research areas include critical youth studies, global educational equality and justice, the social politics of immigration, work and education, as well as alternative forms of radical, popular, democratic and environmental education. He also has an interest in exploring ways to link research and community engagement and labour organisation projects for social and economic justice. Stuart teaches a couple of modules on the Education Studies BA programme, and perhaps most excitingly, he also has a new book entitled Educating for Radical Social Transformation in the Climate Crisis. Stuart, welcome to the podcast.
Hi Laura, thanks for having me.
So Stuart, let's get started. How did you become involved in education and then more so with the IOE?
So I started out, I'm from Canada originally. I did my PhD in California at Stanford University. And I had been doing work with young people from low-income backgrounds mostly who were ending up in pretty low-level jobs in the service sector. And my initial interest in education was starting to think about how can education help address the situation of these young people. And the standard answer, I think, in education, certainly that time, was you get a good education to get out of those crappy jobs and move up into better graduate jobs. And one of the things that I started seeing was that actually a lot of these young people had good degrees, they had good grades, they had good skills. And so I became interested in a question that's really been at the heart of my interest in education ever since, which is how can you use education to help change the world around us? If we want, in the context of jobs and work, if we want education to help all young people and not just a privileged few, and if many jobs are pretty poor quality jobs with low wages and declining working conditions, then really we need an education that can help teach young people how to change jobs, change the workplace, change the labor market to create better jobs. And so that was my initial interest in coming into education, was actually looking at how groups like trade unions and youth groups and community groups we're trying to use a more transformative education to help young people improve their situation in the labor market. And ever since then, I've been interested in that question more broadly beyond the context of the labor market in terms of how can we use education to change the world.
So you started in Canada and in the US, like you say, but how did you then move across to sunny London?
Well, there was no great plan for that. When I was in California, I had become very involved at the time in anti-war protests, actually. This was after 9/11 attacks and after the US went to war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And as a Canadian living in California at the time, I started to feel very alienated from what was going on around the war movement. And I came to the UK, I think I was just coming over here for a couple of months to see some family and get a break. And as life happens, I ended up settling here and made my way to the IOE, which of course is a fantastic place to be to engage in these kinds of questions, both as a teacher and a researcher.
Well, we're very lucky to have you. So you said that you started in education, but you did make this pivot towards climate change and sustainability education. But for our listeners, could you tell us a little bit more about what is climate change or sustainability education? And is there a difference between the two?
Yeah, I think for me, my interest in climate change education had more to do with changes in what's happening in the field of climate change education rather than changes in my own work. So I think to begin with, climate change education used to be quite narrowly defined as a kind of science education, really, understanding the physics of climate change and so forth. But in the last few years, as the climate crisis has intensified, there's been growing concern around that. I think more and more people who are engaged in climate change education see that climate change education needs to be defined much more broadly than that, more broadly than a form of science education, more broadly even than a form of environmental education, but a kind of education that can help students understand the social and economic and cultural causes of climate crisis, but also learn how they can change society in order to address the climate crisis. And so as the kind of definition and the concerns that are at the heart of climate change education have shifted, I suddenly realized that these questions were precisely the kind of questions that I'd long been interested in other contexts. And that was really how I came to this field. And so for me, it's very much think about climate change education in that broader definition that includes a whole set of questions and concerns around how society is organized, how the economy is organized, our kind of cultural discourses, and so forth.
So within this broad definition of climate change education, what kind of learning or aims or agendas do you think needs to be at the heart of this education for children?
Yeah, I think one of the concerns I have at the moment is that as the climate crisis has changed, that the conflicts around climate change education have changed. I think it used to be the struggle was that there were some of us who were concerned about the climate crisis, saw it as a really important problem that needed to be addressed in schools. And there were other groups who denied or obstructed this in some way. And so the kind of the battle lines were to either get climate change education into the curriculum or not. As the climate crisis intensified, I think what we see is groups of all kinds of political backgrounds engaging in one way or another with climate change education. And so what that means, I think, is that just because somebody is promoting climate change education doesn't mean they necessarily share the same politics, share the same ideology, share the same analysis of what the problem is or what needs to be done. And so there really needs to be more careful thinking about what kinds of climate change education different groups are promoting. And in terms of the learning aims, I would highlight kind of three aims that I think are very common, but also I think we need to have some questioning about. One is that a lot of climate change education focuses on increasing students' knowledge about climate change, which of course is important, but we also have a long and very diverse body of research that shows that just because a student knows more about climate change doesn't necessarily lead those students to take action to address the climate crisis. So I think there's a big kind of question about how do we kind of foster action to address the climate crisis. There's a second kind of thing I would highlight is that a lot of climate change education focuses on individual behavior change, right? So this is things like getting students to think about and learn about recycling or how they get to school or work, ride a bike, changing the light bulbs and so forth, all of which are very important things for a number of reasons. But at the same time, I think there needs to be questions about that focus. We know, for example, that groups such as the fossil fuel industry have in the past deliberately tried to emphasize a focus on individual behavior change because it is a way of diverting attention from their own corporate responsibilities for the climate crisis. So that might raise some red flags and alarms around that kind of focus. But also, I think a number of researchers would argue if we're going to address the climate crisis effectively, we need broad-scale structural changes in society, changes in regulation, change in how we organize our economy. And that will require something beyond just individual behavior change, but think about how do we organize collectively to make those changes at a structural level. So those are kind of a couple of areas that I think are kind of questions we need to ask about learning aims. One other area I'd say is that a lot of climate change education remains quite apolitical. There's a kind of universalist frame, right? This kind of sense that the climate crisis is something we're all in this together. We all are responsible for creating the climate crisis and avoiding questions of politics. And this really avoids the crucial questions of what is known as climate justice, right? The idea that certain groups in society are more impacted by climate crisis than others. Certain groups have more responsibility for creating the climate crisis. And also, for example, that there are elite groups in society who may be quite happy with protecting their own interests in the context of the climate crisis, but not looking out for marginalized groups. And if you look at surveys that have been done of climate change education, these kind of questions of climate justice, for example, are very often missing or lacking.
It sounds so broad and so interesting, and it's just where do you start essentially with all those three aims and broader agendas. So within all of that, I guess I'd love to know more about what you see as the role of students and children within the climate crisis, and how this transformative or radical education that you mentioned can play like a tangible part of that.
Yeah, so I mean, of course, in terms of children and young people getting involved in the climate crisis, that has been center stage in the last few years, certainly leading up to the COVID pandemic, where you had the global school strikes for climate and the Friday for Future movement, which is very exciting. And I think a couple things in terms of think about children and youth in relation to the climate crisis. One is if you look at the school climate strikes, I think what's going on there at a broader level is children and young people are asserting their presence and their rights as political subjects, as they're kind of demanding a democratic education, if you like, right? The right to participate directly and meaningfully in things that are affecting their lives, like the climate crisis, which is really important. But it also raises questions for all of us that can be pretty difficult questions, in that our contemporary society and our contemporary school systems are often not set up to support or recognize children and young people as political subjects, that they may obstruct that in a lot of ways. And so I think there's some really important questions about rethinking the kind of nature of democratic education and the rights of children and young people as political subjects that are going to be vital to address in order to kind of keep supporting those roles that children and young people have taken on in things like the climate strikes. Otherwise, there's a kind of danger of kind of tokenism and marginalization and so forth when we talk about children and young people. The other thing I would say is that while, of course, the engagement of children and young people in the climate crisis is really important, I do worry sometimes there's a neglect of the role of adults and the importance of adult education in all of this. One of the theorists and practitioners in the field of radical education, who's very well known, has been very influential on lots of people, including myself, is someone named Miles Horton, who set up a school for social change in the 1930s in the South of the United States called the Highlander Folk School. This was a school that was very involved in supporting the growth of the labor movement in the United States in the 1930s and the civil rights movement in the 1950s. And when Miles Horton set up this school for social change, he explicitly said it needs to be a school for adult education, and that he'd come to see that the kind of statement that we should look to the younger generation to change society was a problem, partly because it was a way of deferring action, right? We'll leave it to the next generation to sort things out. And so even though it sounds good, it can be a way of saying we're not going to do anything here now. But also very practically, if we have a situation like a climate crisis where we need to make some really radical fundamental changes and quite quickly, we need to engage adults in that as well. Adults are the majority of the population, certainly in our society. They're not in school, most of them, and they occupy positions of social and political power. So I think there's a kind of need to make sure that we attend to what's going on in adult education, not just in schools around this issue.
That's really interesting and super timely, given that this podcast will be coming out just before the COP27. So related to that, I guess I just wanted to delve a little bit more into why do you think that it's important to focus on the climate change and crisis now rather than, other issues that are happening and impacting our everyday lives in the here and now. And maybe there's a bit of a spoiler in that I think maybe they're all intertwined slightly, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this and why you think it's important to focus here and now on it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. They're intertwined, but there's a key thing for us as educators is think about how we approach these questions. I do get concerned that in a lot of approaches to climate change education, sometimes it's focused on trying to fix problems or lacks in the students or learners. Why aren't people doing more, thinking more, caring more about the climate crisis? And how do we fix that deficit or that lack? Why are they distracted with all these other issues? And as you say, right now, here in the UK and in many other countries, we face all these other crises, right? A cost of living crisis. People are worried about the cost of housing, the cost of heating and running their homes, fuel costs. There's lots of conflict in the transportation sector. There's concerns about declining wages and working conditions in the job market and so forth. But rather than see that it's a distraction from the climate crisis, these are all issues that are fundamentally at the heart of any a project to address the climate crisis. The climate crisis is fundamentally about issues of housing and fuel, for example. How do we build our homes? Where do we build our homes? How do we heat and run our homes, right? It's about issues of transportation. It's about issues of labor. If we're going to make the kind of fundamental changes that the climate crisis needs, that's going to take a lot of work. And there's going to be questions about how do we create high quality forms of work. So I think one of the principles of a kind of radical or popular transformative education is always we need to start with the interests and needs and concerns of students, of learners, and make the connections, connect the dots. And they are there. And I think I would say in addition to that, very often people aren't going to be concerned about climate crisis or carbon or things like that. Those are very abstract concepts. With my students here at the IOE, when I teach about these issues, some students are very involved in climate crisis issues, but an awful lot don't particularly pressing. But if you talk about concrete issues that are part of their lives, if a student is from Spain and you talk about droughts in Spain and the collapse of the agricultural harvest this year, or if a student has family in Pakistan and talking about the incredible flooding there, these are things that they are going to care about and are going to want to take action. And so I think it really is a kind of challenge for us as educators to think about how do we start with the interests and concerns of where people are at right now.
Excellent. So again, building on that in terms of building on people's interests and where they are at right now, that is maybe an example of good practice. But where do you think we're getting it wrong as educators in terms of the challenges faced within climate change education, and essentially what can we do about them to make it more effective, I guess?
Yeah, so I've talked about some of those issues earlier in terms of a kind of a narrow focus on climate science knowledge and individual behavior change and so forth. I think the question or concern that I've taken up in the book that I've worked on this recently is thinking about the need for a more radical or transformative climate change. And this isn't just me, this is increasing a kind of recognition among researchers and fairly mainstream researchers and policymakers that certainly the last 4 or 5 years there's been a sense that to address the climate crisis effectively, it's not just a matter of a few small policy changes or technical changes here or there, but requires fundamental changes in society and the economy. So if you go back, for example, there's reports done by the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released a report in 2018 that explicitly called for this. We said saying that we need fundamental radical changes in society and economy in order to address the climate crisis. And you'll see educators recognizing this too, that if we need to have fundamental radical changes in society and economy, the kind of education we need is an education that will help students learn about what kind of changes do we need and how do we make those changes. A radical kind of education. And you'll see a growing number of books and articles addressing this question of how to develop a transformative, transgressive, radical kind of climate change education. The problem with that is that's not what's on the agenda in a lot of education systems, right? That commitment, even that kind of agreement that we need that kind of radical education. And also, I think it's something that a lot of our school systems, of course, aren't set up to do. And a lot of teachers and school leaders might feel quite uncomfortable about that. This idea that we're supposed to be using education to teach kids and older people how to make radical changes in society. That might fly in the face of how we've learned to think about what good education is or ethical education is, objective, neutral education, and so forth. So I think it does raise a lot of questions if we're going to do that kind of more radical and transformative education as opposed to these kind of more narrowly defined forms of climate change education.
So also, Stuart, you have a new book out that is hopefully also going to contribute to some of these discussions. The book's entitled Educating for Radical Social Transformation in the Climate Crisis. So could you tell us a little bit more about the book, how it came to be, and where you hope it will take you next?
Sure, yeah. So the core question of the book relates to what I've been talking about is this idea that if we need to make radical changes in society and economy in order to effectively address the climate crisis, then for education to contribute to that, we need a kind of education that can help students make radical changes in society. And the idea of the book is really twofold. One is to try and learn from theorists and practitioners and activists who are currently engaged in trying to develop this kind of transformative or radical or transgressive climate change education. What are the kind of ideas? What are the strategies they're developing? What are the challenges and obstacles? And what can we learn from those? The contribution to the book, I hope, is to point out that there's a long history of radical education, of transformative education, that has often existed on the, kind of the margins of mainstream educational practice and research and theory, but nonetheless has a rich body of practice, of theory, and so forth, not directly addressed to issues of environment and climate crisis, but that over the years has taken up issues of democracy, of inclusion, of anti-racism, of feminism, and so forth. And so the idea of the book is how can we learn from that longer history of radical education that might inform our efforts to develop effective climate change education in the here and now. And I would just say in terms of the concept of radical education, it's an umbrella concept that refers to lots of different traditions of education, but I think it's a form of education that tends to have a number of characteristics at its heart. Radical means going to the roots. Yes? So radical education is an education that is working with students to understand the root causes of climate crisis in the structures of economy, of society, culture, and so forth. That's one characteristic. It's a utopian education. So it's very much about thinking about working with students to envision a different kind of world, a better world that we should be aiming towards. It's more inclusive and just and democratic and sustainable. It's also a very strategic and pragmatic education in that it's thinking about how do we get from here to there? What do we need? What do we need to learn? What do we need to do in terms of making those changes? And very often, not just about the individual changes we need to make in our own lives and our own ways of thinking, but how do we develop collective forms of learning and action that can make those structural changes. And the final characteristic I would say of radical education, it's an explicitly political education, and recognizing that the climate crisis, like any form of social crisis, is going to be deeply conceptual. There's different groups with different interests and agendas at stake, and that needs to be brought front and center of how we think about making changes in society for the climate, to address the climate crisis. So that's what the book does. It's really bringing together these two different bodies of literature with the hope that it's useful for our thinking, but also for practice on the ground.
Excellent. So what's next for you then?
So right now, I've been interested in picking up one of the kind of gaps or absences I mentioned earlier, where I think there's some really exciting focus at the moment on climate change education with children and young people in schools, but that there's been a neglect of climate change education with adults. And so my interest is actually going back to my roots, which was to start out in thinking about education and organizing in the workplace and looking at what trade unions and other worker organizations are doing now in terms of fostering climate change education and climate change organizing and action, both hoping to find some really exciting and inspiring models of that kind of education, but also becoming aware of what are some of the challenges and obstacles. And again, the idea is really to kind of expand our focus on the different kinds of education related to the climate crisis with different groups in society, all of which are going to be essential if we are going to be able to effectively address the crisis together.
Thank you, Stuart. It's been really interesting to learn more about your research and your career, but especially I feel like I've also gained a broader understanding of what you mean by climate change education. Like you say, not just for children, but also as adults, that hopefully we can have meaningful change as well. So thank you very much for all of your insights today.
Thanks for having me on the program.
You can follow Stuart on Twitter at @Tannock to learn more about his research. Some of what we've covered today is also available in the episode notes. If you've enjoyed this episode, there's more where this came from. Search IOE Podcast to find episodes of Research for the Real World, as well as more podcasts from IOE. And a quick favour before I go, if you are listening to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we'd really appreciate it if you could give the IOE Podcast a rating. 5 stars would be fantastic. This will really help us to spread our research about such important work. I'm Dr Laura Outhwaite, and thank you for listening.
Research for the Real World is produced by IOE Marketing and Communications and IOE Research Development. The theme music was created by Rob Cochran. Tatiana Sotero Diaz is the series advisor, Amy Leibowitz is the series producer, and Jason Ilagan is the executive producer of the IOE podcast.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast.